It has been a while since I did a fake quotes video, and I decided this time that I would go back to somebody at the not quite start, but early origins of philosophy, and that is Socrates. As it turns out, there are quite a few fake quotes that are circulating around, getting attributed to him, clogging up the internet and our intellects if we buy into them. So we're going to look at a bunch of these, and I'll tell you what we know about them. Some of them may be a little bit surprising to you. So let's take a look at all of them in turn. Here's the first one. Be moderate in everything, including moderation. And there's a bunch of different variations on this that you can find floating around out there. This one is all things in moderation, including moderation. There's about 5 or 6 alternate phrasings that you can find. All of them don't come from Socrates, at least in any of the texts that we have that more or less, we guess, faithfully reproduce what he said. Hesiod actually said, observe, do, measure, moderation is best in all things, but that doesn't have anything to do with moderating moderation. We also know that the Delphic maxim, nothing too much, has to do with moderation. And so where does this come from? Well, we find that there is a collection based on ancient Greek poetry called Pagan Pictures that had a 4-line verse called Moderation, in which we find be moderate in moderation, and the notes in the anthology claimed that they were also based on earlier ones, but there was no actual citation for the verse. So that's probably where it's coming from. It might have been just made up on the spot. The next one I think is probably familiar to many of us. I know that I know nothing. Now, Socrates said things kind of like this, but he didn't say precisely this. And anybody who's actually read some Plato, particularly the early dialogues, knows that Socrates would be not just being ironic, but actually lying were he to claim that he knows nothing. Even in the Apology, he does claim to know some things. And it's not just that he knows nothing. So where did this come from? Originally, there is a phrase in Latin that's a possible paraphrase from a Greek text, ipsis in nihil scire id unum sciat. It's also quoted as scio me nihil scire or scio me nescire, and then it's back translated into Greek later on. Now, Diogenes Laertes is going to tell us in a book written hundreds of years after Plato that Socrates would say that he knew nothing except that he knew that very fact, auto tuto, namely that he knew nothing, which is similar to this, but not quite the same. And Diogenes is probably not somebody to be trusted when it comes to this. So another fake quote that this one is a little bit closer to what Socrates is attested to having said. Here's a third one that has probably taken a lot of people in. True wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us. Now, that is often presented as if it's a direct quote from Socrates himself, but it's actually very, very recent. It is coming from a 1974 book by Manuel J. Smith called When I Say No, I Feel Guilty, and it's his description of Socrates' teachings. Is it an accurate description? I would say no. He's picked up on that I know nothing bit and gone too far with that, probably so that he could feel like he's a cool guy saying cool things. I don't really know. But in any case, it's not coming from Socrates himself, so it is another fake quote. Here we get to a very funny fake quote, and this one has a lot of commonalities with others that are circulating around out there, sometimes attributed to people like Cicero or others, about just how bad the kids are these days. And, what it does go to show us, if there's any truth to it, is that people do like to complain about children. So it runs like this. The children now love luxury, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teacher. So that's an awful lot that's being ascribed to children. Did Socrates say anything remotely like that? It does not appear so. There is nothing that should give us the idea that this is actually Socrates. And we do find that there's kind of a paper trail. So it's adapted from a dissertation published in 1907, posthumously after the author's death, titled Schools of Hellas, and by a guy named Kenneth John Freeman. Later on, in 1923, it shows up in a document called the Massachusetts Teacher, Volume 3, and from that point, it begins to appear in educational writing from the 1950s onward. Somehow it winds up getting attributed to Socrates, and everybody just kind of goes with it. Speaking of education, here's another one that bears directly on that topic. Education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. This is not by Socrates as far as we know, and it could be stemming from something coming from Plutarch, who's, again, a writer much, much later on, who says the correct analogy for the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting no more, and then it motivates one towards originality and instills the desire for truth. Okay, so there's some mention of flame there. It's not the exact quote. Where we find this is in the 1990s in an article by Douglas Bradley, and it actually stems from Wisconsin. It's from Wisconsin Ideas in the University of Wisconsin system. The article is called Lighting a Flame in the Kickapoo Valley. And so, this is a kind of cool catchphrase, but it's not Socrates. I will point out that Socrates in the Symposium does talk about the transfer of knowledge as not being like something that you just fill your head with, but there the metaphor is somewhat different. Here's another interesting one. You're not really sure why anyone would attribute this to Socrates, especially given how many other authors much later on talked about the connection between philosophy and leisure. So beware the barrenness of a busy life. And it turns out that this originated in the United States as an aphorism that evangelical Protestants were using. And the earliest attested usage comes from a document called the Church Missionary Review, Volume 53 in 1902, which says, "Let me give you 2 words of warning from my own experience. The one is beware of the barrenness of a busy life. And then the other is beware of the words which break the bond of fellowship with those with whom you work. Beware the barrenness of a busy life. Beware of the words which break the bond of fellowship with those with whom you work." So he's repeating it, I guess to drill it in, right? And it becomes popular among Protestants, shows up all over the place for a while from the 1950s through the 1980s. How did it get attributed to Socrates? Nobody knows. Here's another very popular one, which runs, "When the debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser." Now, doesn't that sound clever? So this is found in a variety of places in the 2000s. It appears to have originated in a personal website in 2006. It shows up in Twitter already by 2008. And then we find it in a 2013 book by John Taylor called Chewing the Cud: Alcibiades and Socrates Talk Life, Love, and Nietzsche, which is purportedly a dialogue. And this one has a very interesting later history. In recent years, in 2019, Eric Trump tweeted this very quote, and he attributed it to Socrates, and he got called on the carpet almost immediately for making fake quotes. Here's another very new one as well. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but building the new. Now, if you know anything about Socrates, this does not sound remotely like anything he would ever have said. Focusing all your energy, very new agey, isn't it? So this is actually from a character named Socrates in a book by Dan Millman called The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, a book that changes lives. This was a more or less fictional memoir exploring the challenges that Millman had faced himself, and he meets an all-night gas station attendant who becomes his mentor, and he gives this counselor the nickname Socrates. So it is attributed to a Socrates. It's not by the Socrates who we all have in mind. Here's another false attribution. The greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be. And I guess in the case of this particular author who is ascribing it to Socrates, what he pretends to be is somebody who actually tells the truth about where he's getting his information. This is actually from Stephen Covey, who everybody knows from the 7 Habits stuff. This is from Principle-Centered Leadership. I would think that one principle of good leadership would be not making things up and attributing them to people so as to sound clever or authoritative, but I guess Covey is okay with that. So clearly not a real quote by Socrates. It would be weird for him to say this, that we should actually be what we pretend to be. Perhaps Socrates, if he were to take this on, would ask Covey some pointed questions about it. Here's another funny one that shows up. By all means, marry. If you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad one, you'll become a philosopher. Now, there is a somewhat authentic basis for some of this in Xenophon's Symposium. Socrates is talking with Antisthenes, who asks him why he married Xanthippe, who he describes as a wife who's the hardest to get along with of all the women that are. And Socrates says, well, I observe people wishing to become great horsemen don't acquire the most docile horses, but high-spirited ones, thinking that if they can manage this kind, they can handle any other. I'm doing the same thing. Humankind at large is what I wish to deal and associate with. So I've got her, well assured that if I can endure her, I will have no difficulty in my relations with all the rest of humankind. Notice what's missing there, saying that if you get a bad wife, you will become a philosopher. He's also not even saying that she's a bad wife. She's just difficult to get along with. Now, the exact words are going to show up much, much later in the 20th century. In the Golden Book magazine, in the 1935 issues, we see, marry by all means. If you get a good wife, you will become very happy. If you get a bad one, you will become a philosopher, and that is good for every man. In 1949, Hilda Holland, in a book called Why Are You Single?, says, when asked by a young man whether to marry, Socrates is said to have replied, by all means, marry. If you will get for yourself a good wife, you will be happy forever after. And if by chance you get a common scold like my Xanthippe, well, then you will become a philosopher. So a longer-winded version of this. It's also found in the Speaker's Handbook of Epigrams and Wit criticisms in 1955 written by Herbert Prochnow and attributed to somebody different than Socrates, Sidney Smith. So perhaps it originated with him. We don't really know, but it's not a quote by Socrates himself. We come at last to the shortest of all of these, know thyself. Now, if you know anything about ancient history and culture, the idea of somebody attributing this to Socrates is completely laughable because you know that it is one of the Delphic maxims, perhaps the most famous of all of the Delphic maxims. It does show up in Plato's dialogues and in Xenophon's memorabilia. Socrates does say it, but Socrates is himself quoting it, so it is not something that Socrates is actually advocating. Usually he's saying, this is a really interesting thing. Let's figure out what it actually means. There is also a variation on this. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, which also gets attributed to Socrates, but more frequently to somebody else who also didn't say it, which is Aristotle. I'm not quite sure why it circulates around like that, but that's what we see. So there you have it. There's a number of different fake quotes that we have now debunked. Try not to circulate them around. You should always be relatively suspicious of quotes that are not being attributed. You should have some healthy suspicion. Try not to repost things that you don't actually know the provenance of. And there's nothing wrong with when somebody does post a quote and you're not quite sure if it's real, asking them for the sources of it. I think it can also be quite helpful for you to check out a few websites, including for Socrates in particular, Sententiae Antiquae. Quote Investigator is quite good. We also have Wiki Quotes, which has some good sections on that. And I'll also give a shout out to Tales of Times Forgotten as well. So there you have it. We'll do more of these in the future, but this takes care of some of the most common and egregious fake quotes misattributed to the old guy Socrates.